Welcome back to our study through the book of Daniel, or at least the first 6 chapters. Now, the last time we were here, we learned about our friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They got thrown into a fiery furnace. It was so hot it burnt up the dudes who threw them in the furnace. Yet, because God was with them, they escaped completely unharmed. And so, our buddy King Nebuchadnezzar, old Nebby, was quite distraught and realized, of course, who God is, somebody who is bigger than him. We now come to chapter 4 of Daniel. And even though in the first 3 chapters of this book so far, Nebuchadnezzar, every chapter has learned a different lesson about God, still Nebuchadnezzar has something to learn. Chapter 4 is actually my favorite chapter of Daniel. It's also the weirdest chapter of Daniel, which is why I'm quite fond of it. When we get to Daniel chapter 4, we see something different. In the other chapters so far, we've had the focus be on Daniel and his buddies. This chapter, Daniel's there, but very briefly, this is about Nebuchadnezzar. In fact, this is written essentially as a page from his diary. It's fascinating, it's weird. He kind of turns into a cow. We're going to get there. Listen, starting in verse 1. King Nebuchadnezzar, to those of every people, nation, and language who live on the whole earth, may your prosperity increase. I am pleased to tell you about the miracles and wonders the Most High God has done for me. How great are his miracles, and how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an eternal kingdom, and his dominion is from generation to generation. What's happened here? This is King Nebuchadnezzar, the guy who's in charge of the whole world, who enslaves the very people of this God he's now praising in chapter 4, and throws this God's treasures in his temple with a whole bunch of other ones. Remember, we said Nebuchadnezzar, like so many ancient rulers, collected the artifacts from other religions, like somebody collecting Pokemon cards. Yet here Nebuchadnezzar is praising God to every people, every nation, every language, everyone on the whole earth. Nebuchadnezzar is telling them, this God, the Most High God, the God of the Jews, this guy is something, and he rules forever. So what has happened here? Well, let's look at verse 4 and see. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my house and flourishing in my palace. I had a dream, and it frightened me. While in my bed, the images and visions of my mind alarmed me. So I issued a decree to bring in all the wise men of Babylon to me, in order that they might make known the dream's interpretation. When the magicians, mediums, Chaldeans, and diviners came in, I told them the dream, but they could not make its interpretation known to me. Let's start off here. What's really interesting, you remember in chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream where he sees this weird statue, right? And he calls in everybody to come in, and he says, you have to tell me what I dreamed and what it means, because if I just tell you the dream, you're going to make up some interpretation to flatter me. Tell me what I dreamed, and then I'll know you have the power to tell me what it means. Well, Nebuchadnezzar doesn't do that this time. He doesn't threaten to tear people limb from limb and make their houses a garbage dump. He tells them the dream, yet, of course, they can't tell him what it means. They don't even try to flatter him with some interpretation that says, oh, Nebby, you had this dream and it just says you're the best. And Nebby says, oh, shucks. No, nothing like that happens. They don't even attempt to understand the dream. Here's the good news. Verse 8. Finally, Daniel comes in. Now remember, Daniel can solve these mysteries, can give these interpretations, not because he's hot stuff, but because of his God. Remember, the big questions we're looking at in Daniel, where is God? Because Israel right now is in exile under the reign of old Nebby, who is quite vicious, who is quite evil, and doesn't worship the one true God, at least not at this point in the story. And so while they're in exile, they're wondering, how do we live for God in this time? Daniel's decided all the way in chapter 1, when he first gets taken to Babylon, I'm going to be faithful to God no matter what it costs, no matter what it takes to maintain my convictions that God is God and nobody else. Daniel's maintained these convictions, and so God's blessed him and used him in such a powerful way in Babylon so far. And so that's what we're seeing. Daniel shows up on the scene, and after 3 chapters of this, we know Daniel shows up, and it's going to be good news for some mystery that can't be solved by anybody else. Finally, Daniel, named Belshazzar after the name of my God, and the spirit of the holy gods is in him, came before me. Now, this is really interesting. First of all, remember, Nebuchadnezzar drags these guys in from Israel. He takes the very best of them to indoctrinate, to bring into his royal court. He gives them all new names. Their names originally, the name of Daniel and his three buddies, they were things about the one true God, the God of Israel. Things like, God is my judge. And then Nebuchadnezzar comes and he scratches out God and he puts in the name of some other God that he worships, right? Well, Daniel comes in. He's named after Nebuchadnezzar's God, but Nebuchadnezzar's God hasn't done anything for him. It's only the one true God who is working through Daniel. Yet even Nebuchadnezzar can recognize that because he said, a spirit of the holy gods is in him. So Nebuchadnezzar recognizes there is something different about Daniel. And of course, what's different is that God is working through him because Daniel's resolved to be faithful no matter what. And God has blessed that faithfulness. I told Daniel the dream. Belshazzar, head of the magicians, because I know that you have the spirit of the holy gods and that no mystery puzzles you. Explain to me the visions of my dream that I saw and its interpretation. In the visions of my mind, as I was lying in bed, I saw this. There was a tree in the middle of the earth, and it was very tall. The tree grew large and strong. Its top reached the sky, and it was visible to the ends of the earth. Its leaves were beautiful, its fruit abundant, and on it was food for all. Wild animals found shelter under it. The birds of the sky lived in its branches, and every creature was fed from it. So let's stop here. So Nebuchadnezzar has this dream. There's a very tall tree. It's in the middle of the earth, the center of the earth. It's big. It's beautiful. All sorts of animals benefit from taking shelter under this tree, and they eat of its fruit. It says in verse 13, as I was lying in my bed, I also saw in the visions of my mind a watcher, a holy one, coming down from heaven. So some sort of angelic messenger is coming down from heaven. Verse 14, he called out loudly, cut down the tree and chop off its branches. Strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the animals flee from under it and the birds from its branches, but leave the stump with its roots in the ground, and a band of iron and bronze around it, and the tender grass of the field. Let him be drenched with dew from the sky and share the plants of the earth with the animals. Let his mind be changed from that of a human, and let him be given the mind of an animal for 7 periods of time. This word is by decree of the watchers, and the decision is by command from the holy ones, so that the living will know that the Most High is ruler over human kingdoms. He gives them to anyone he wants and sets the lowliest of people over them. What's happened here? So Nebuchadnezzar just had a dream about this great big tree, and then somebody comes down from heaven and says, cut down the tree, strip its leaves, destroy its fruit, make all the animals leave from under it. And then, verse 16, let his mind be changed from that of a human and let him be given the mind of an animal. So all of a sudden, we're not talking about a tree anymore. We're talking about a person. What's going on here? This is why Nebuchadnezzar's so worried. He has this dream. It's about a big tree. It gets destroyed. And then they're talking about a human all of a sudden. Now, if we remember from chapter 2, as Nebuchadnezzar should have remembered, remember Nebuchadnezzar has a dream about the statue. It's all these different materials. And Daniel says, this is what the dream means, Nebuchadnezzar. Your kingdom, the head of gold, is eventually going to give way to a kingdom of silver, then to bronze, so on and so on. All these kingdoms of the earth are going to be destroyed eventually, and God will establish his one true forever kingdom. And so Nebuchadnezzar should have already figured out that's about what some of his dreams would be like. And so there's this big tree, it falls down. Maybe that big tree is Nebuchadnezzar. Maybe that's actually what he's worried about, and that's why he's going to Daniel. So he tells Daniel his dream, and then he says, now Belshazzar, tell me the interpretation, because none of the wise men of my kingdom can make the interpretation known to me. But you can, because you have a spirit of the holy gods. Then Daniel, whose name was Belshazzar, was stunned for a moment, and his thoughts alarmed him. So Daniel's figured out what this dream is meant, and it shocked him. We can say he was bamboozled. He doesn't quite know what to do with it. The king said, Belshazzar, don't let the dream or its interpretation alarm you. Belshazzar answered, My lord, may the dream apply to those who hate you, and its interpretation to your enemies. Now, Daniel's about to say this is bad news for Nebuchadnezzar, what the dream means. Daniel's been here at this point for many, many years as a top advisor in Nebuchadnezzar's court. At this point, they were friends. You see, living in exile, being cast away from God's people, from God's land, it was a scary thing for Daniel and his friends, yes, but they made the most of it. And they said, whatever the situation, we're going to be faithful, we're going to honor God, but we're also going to submit to the leadership above us as much as we can without sacrificing any godly convictions. And so this is what Daniel had done for many years, and being such a great advisor to the king, now they were quite close. And so Daniel's upset that Nebuchadnezzar has this dream. And this is what he says it means. The tree you saw, which grew large and strong, whose top reached to the sky and was visible to the whole earth, and whose leaves were beautiful and its fruit abundant, and on it was food for all. Under it the wild animals lived, and its branches the birds of the sky lived. That tree is you, your majesty, for you have become great and strong. Your greatness has grown and reaches even the sky. Your dominion extends to the ends of the earth. The king saw a watcher, a holy one, coming down from heaven and saying, Cut the tree down, destroy it. And he repeats what this messenger says. This is the interpretation, your majesty, and this is the decree of the Most High that has been issued against my lord the king. You will be driven away from people to live with wild animals. Because remember, this angelic messenger says, Let him be given the mind of an animal. Let him eat the grass of the field, these sorts of things. You'll be driven away from people to live with the wild animals. You'll feed on grass like cattle and be drenched with dew from the sky for 7 periods of time until you acknowledge that the Most High, meaning God, the one true God, the God who obviously is Most High because he's the creator and ruler of everything, until you acknowledge that the Most High is ruler over human kingdoms and he gives them to anyone he wants. As for their command to leave the tree stump with its roots, your kingdom will be destroyed to you as soon as you acknowledge that heaven rules. Therefore, may my advice seem good to you, my king. Separate yourself from your sins by doing what is right, and from your injustices by showing mercy to the needy. Perhaps there will be an extension of your prosperity. So here's what's going on. Nebuchadnezzar is about to be sent away. And we hear that it's for 7 periods of time. Now, 7 in the Bible, it's a picture of completeness. We see all the way back in Genesis 1 and 2, God creates the world and he does it in 7 days. And so in the Bible, 7 represents a wholeness, a completeness. And so this angelic messenger says that the king is going to be driven away to live in the wilderness like an animal for 7 periods of time. And we're not exactly sure what that means. It could mean, for example, 7 weeks, 7 months, 7 years. But really what I think the messenger is meaning is that Nebuchadnezzar is going to be sent away to live like an animal as long as it takes him to acknowledge that God is bigger than him, and the only reason he has this kingdom is because God gave it to him. And so we have this lovely picture here that we haven't talked much about yet. We're going to get into it because Daniel says, perhaps if you start doing what's right and you're merciful to those in need and these sorts of things, maybe God will extend your prosperity and these things won't happen. But here's what we read in verse 28. All this happened to King Nebuchadnezzar. So all this stuff that he was just warned about, it happened. And we're going to figure out how. At the end of the 12 months, as he was walking around on the roof of the royal palace in Babylon. I love this. The king exclaimed, Is this not Babylon the Great, that I have built to be a royal residence for my vast power and for my majestic glory? Now, this is a big no-no. It's been a year since Nebuchadnezzar was warned. These things are going to happen if you don't acknowledge that God is God, that God is giving you a kingdom. He's bigger than you. He's better than you. And Nebuchadnezzar is marching around on his palace roof that's only there because God gave it to him. And he says, Aren't I hot stuff? Look at all this stuff I did. He even uses the word glory. I built this palace for my majestic glory. You know what God says in the Bible? I will give my glory to no other. God will be glorified as creator, as ruler, as king. Nebuchadnezzar already has been told this so many times in the years since Daniel and his friends have been there in Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar doesn't get it. God gives him a full year after the upteenth warning to change his ways, and yet he doesn't. So, verse 31, while the words were still in the king's mouth, while the king was still speaking these things, a voice came from heaven. King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is declared that the kingdom has departed from you. You will be driven away from people to live with wild animals, and you will feed on grass like a cattle for 7 periods of time, until you acknowledge that the Most High is ruler over human kingdoms, and he gives them to anyone he wants. At that moment, instantaneously, the message against Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away from people. He ate grass like cattle, and his body was drenched with dew from the sky, until his hair grew like eagle's feathers, and his nails like birds' claws. And that brings us to our iconic picture. This is an artist's rendition of about what Nebuchadnezzar would look like. And yeah, he was king of the whole world, and he looked like this. So Nebuchadnezzar is driven out for 7 periods of time. Again, what that really means is Nebuchadnezzar is going to be in this state, looking like that, smelling like some kind of nasty, for as long as it takes for him to figure out God is bigger than him. And so this is what happens to King Nebuchadnezzar. His nails grow so long they're like talons from an eagle. His whole body is covered in hair. It's a gross picture. This is the king of the world, and this is what happens to him. You know why? Because God is bigger than him. Where is God? God's in heaven. And you know what he's doing on earth? Putting people in place that he wants to put in place, taking people out who he needs to take out. This is what the whole book of Daniel has been teaching us so far, and what God's been trying to say to Nebuchadnezzar. But he didn't get it. Here's the good news, verse 34. But at the end of those days, so at the end of this period of time that he's out here living like a cow, some sort of weird animal, I, Nebuchadnezzar, looked up to heaven. My sanity returned to me. Then I praised the Most High God and honored and glorified him who lives forever. This is a beautiful picture. So Nebuchadnezzar crawling on his hands and feet, drenched in rain and filth, his hair growing all over his body, his nails like bird's claws. He can't speak. He can't think. His mind is like an animal's, remember. He is in some sort of weird state, but he looks up to heaven. Nebuchadnezzar's never looked up in his life. He's looked down on everybody. Remember, he was walking around on his palace roof, looking down at his palace, looking down at all the people in his kingdom. Nebuchadnezzar's never looked up in his life because he didn't want to acknowledge somebody was bigger than him. He said some things like that about God all the way back in chapter 2. He gave God lip service, yes. But there was never a true recognition of his need to look to God who is bigger than him. But at the end of those days, at the end of this period of time where Nebuchadnezzar is taught a lesson in humility, he looks up, he looks to God. And then his sanity returns to me, and the first thing he does is praise and glorify God. He was saying just a few verses ago, isn't this palace great and it reflects my glory? Now he's looking up to God saying, your glory, God. Nebuchadnezzar is a changed man. Here's what he says at the end of verse 34 onward. For his dominion, that is God's dominion, is an everlasting dominion. His kingdom is from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are counted as nothing. And he does what he wants with the army of heaven and the inhabitants of the earth. There is no one who can block his hand or say to him, what have you done? At that time my sanity returned to me, and my majesty and splendor returned to me for the glory of my kingdom. My advisors and my nobles sought me out, and I was reestablished over my kingdom, and even more greatness came to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, and glorify the King of heavens, because all his works are true and his ways are just. He is able to humble those who walk in pride. This is the end of our friend King Nebuchadnezzar that we read in Daniel. He looks up to God. His sanity is restored to him. And the first thing he does is praise God for his rule lasting forever. Nebuchadnezzar thought he lasted forever, right? In chapter 3, he built this giant gold statue, talking representing just how great he thinks he is. Now he's saying God's kingdom is forever and ever, not mine. And because Nebuchadnezzar recognizes who God is and turns to him, his kingdom is restored to him. This kingdom prospers. But verse 37, now Nebuchadnezzar is praising, exalting, and glorifying God because of who God is and what God does. And we finally read, he is able to humble those who walk in pride. He's able to show those who think they're bigger than him, that is, those who think they're bigger than God, who think they can determine who they are and how they live, think all the gifts they have are theirs, produced by their works to be used for their purposes, their glory. God is able to humble those. The story of the Bible points ultimately to a day when those folks will be humbled. Because this everlasting kingdom that Nebuchadnezzar's talking about, that Daniel's talking about, is ultimately the kingdom of Christ. Jesus, who came down to be the perfect sinless sacrifice for humanity, that all who would turn to him and say, I'm a sinful creature, I don't know how to live the way that God would have me to do. I need Jesus' help to do that. Those who turn to Jesus will be spared. They will prosper. But those who don't will be humbled. They will be brought low. Ultimately, they will be destroyed eternally in hell. That's scary. But the good news is that all those who turn to God, even Nebuchadnezzar, who was so wicked, he killed the last of the Jewish kings' sons right in front of him, then gouged his eyes out and made him sit at his table like a pet for the rest of his life. This is how wicked Nebuchadnezzar was. He took the treasures from God's temple that not even the priest could touch. He took them for his own treasury. This is how wicked Nebuchadnezzar was, yet God gave him chance and chance and chance again to turn to him. And finally, when Nebuchadnezzar did, the Lord honored that. Because it's not Nebuchadnezzar who is right. It's not Nebuchadnezzar who has it all figured out. He looked up to God and said, I'm not God. You are, and I'm turning to you. And that's what we all need to do. The next time in Daniel chapter 5, we're going to learn about a guy who didn't do that. And I hope you'll join us for that.